just dive right in. This is a talk about AI to expand human capacity. I'm at something called the Bike Shop at MIT. I'll try to tell you what that means. It doesn't involve me repairing your bike. I want to start with this word expand. If I said to you, will AI expand human capacity? I think the answer I'm going to try and convince you of is yes, it will. But if you said, will AI diminish human capacity? The answer I want to convince you of today is yes. And to understand how both of these things can be true, that is going to be the essence of this talk. And to make sense of that, I'm going to have to put on my sort of professorial hat and do a little bit of educating. And so I'm going to try and give you 3 lessons about AI. And that's going to be the basis of how I build out my case. So the first lesson of AI, don't worry, it won't be that painful. It'll start off with something you all are hopefully familiar with. How many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz? Raise your hand. Great. How many of you have read The Wizard of Oz? Raise your hand. Okay, wonderful. This is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Baum. Those of you who've read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, how many of you read the second book? Holy cow! That's amazing. Well, you, sir, have you read the third book, the fourth, the fifth? Oh, you have read every... You know what? I'm just stopping right now. This is not worth continuing. Well, I have not read either the first, second, fourth, 15. Like with many books, I've not read them, but I'm going to talk about them because I have looked at their covers. And what I want to talk is about my favorite book, by which I mean my favorite cover, the 15th book of The Wizard of Oz. The 15th book of The Wizard of Oz has a fantastic cover. Well, actually, it has 2 covers. And if you look at these 2 covers, you'll realize something amazing about these 2 covers. Anyone notice it yet? What makes these covers amazing is that there are 2 separate authors listed. In one rendition, it's Frank Baum, and another, it's Ruth Plumley Thompson. In fact, there are printed editions with both their names. Who wrote the 15th book of Oz? I'm sure you're all curious to find out. And as was a big literary community, scholars, researchers, scientists, this is what we spend our time on, trying to figure out who wrote the 15th book of Oz. The way they would do it was close readings of these books and try to understand Baum's style and Thompson's style. And they were very much at loggerheads. They did not agree. When into the foray came one of my favorite papers. That is correct. What I am now going to give you is a rendition of this paper, but you will have to allow me a little bit of literary license. All the facts are right, but I'm just going to embellish. It is after all fiction. So what does this paper do? In a nutshell, what this paper does in modern terms is it builds an algorithm. The algorithm it says is, let's take training data. Books 1 through 14, we know Baum wrote it. Books 16 through 30, we know Thompson wrote it. Let's take excerpts from those books. We'll keep a few excerpts aside, but we're going to train this algorithm to take all of those little pieces of things and tell it, this piece came from Baum, these pieces came from Thompson. Train an algorithm to learn, to figure it all out. Now we have a little algorithm. That's a technical figure for an algorithm. That algorithm is able to predict on new texts, was this piece from Baum or Thompson? Okay, so how did this algorithm do? Well, let us show you how it did. So on the x-axis are the various books, pieces from those books it has never seen before. And on the y-axis is its guess of whether that piece comes from Baum or Thompson. Well, if you show a piece it's never seen before from books 1 through 14, it says, for sure, it is Baum. That's pretty good. Then you show it from 16 to 30, it says, for sure, Thompson. When I say for sure, this is like a perfect out-of-sample fit. I've never seen this in my life. It's amazing. Now, I'm sure when this all started, you're like, I cannot believe this guy's going to talk to me about this for so long. But now you're rested, aren't you? You really want to know what it says here, don't you? So let's find out. Let's go into book 15. Let's blow it up chapter by chapter. So we go into book 15, we blow it up chapter by chapter, and the algorithm sees something that all of these scholars had failed to see. It not only understands what Baum wrote and what Thompson wrote, it actually gets correct the time at which Baum dies. Chapter 12, he wrote until chapter 12, he dies, Thompson takes over, barely touches a word, continues right along. Isn't that amazing? Language is the most human of activities. But yet in language, this algorithm manages to see something that we did not. And that is the first lesson I would like for you to remember. algorithms have an amazing capacity to notice things that we as humans cannot notice, do not observe. There's a footnote to, I'm an academic, I have to have footnotes. There's a footnote to this, and an important footnote. This is not a footnote I would have given 5 years ago, but in this modern era, I feel very compelled to give this footnote. To give this footnote, I'm going to talk about the International Math Olympiad Challenge. How many of you know what this is? This is the thing like many of the cool kids in high school do. It's like really fun and interesting. I have no idea what it is. Recently, there were reports that, and pretty well established report, I think this is a Gemini team, that this was had done extremely well on the International Math Olympiad, amongst the hardest thing. I think it managed to get a silver medal, the equivalent of a silver medal, which is very, very hard to do. At the same time, the same algorithm that does that, if you were to give it the task of multiplying two 4-digit numbers, it gets many of those wrong. This is not some made-up random example. It is an example I'm not going to go too much into today, but I'm using it to illustrate a second point. Algorithms can do things we cannot, but they actually struggle mightily with some things that strike us as pretty obvious. My favorite example of this comes from an undergraduate of mine who in a class, we asked them to generate these things. She came up with this one. So you can give this to Gemini. You can say, suppose you're given the following information: train, car, and metro. Here are the travel times. Here's the travel costs. I'd like some help from you as to which transportation which transportation mode you would choose. And it says, no problem, I got this. Here's how I'm going to decide this. I'm going to calculate cost per minute. It does all that correct, don't worry. And then on the basis of this, I'm going to tell you, you know what's a really good deal? The train. You get a lot of minutes per dollar. I know some Europeans might find that useful, but we're Americans. So as one on the left, first lesson, algorithms can see things we cannot, but struggle with things we find easy. All right, second lesson about AI. The second lesson, I want to go to a far more grim topic. It is the fact that in the United States, this is a shock to this day, I find this shocking. There are over 12 million arrests every year in a country of about 300 million people. That doesn't need any saying, that is crazy. But right after arrest, there's a very hard decision, which is where should the defendant wait for trial? It's a very consequential decision. If the person is sent to jail, they're going to be there for 3 to 9 months. Their life is effectively over. On the other hand, if you release someone who goes on to commit a very serious crime while they're waiting for trial, that is a crime you could have averted. It is a very hard decision because a judge must look at the person, have a conversation, look at their background, and make a prediction of what is this person's risk. That's very hard. If you think about it, in many ways, this is not, though far more consequential, far more grave, it is not too dissimilar to the Wizard of Oz problem, where you had a human expert looking at this trove and massive information, trying to understand what to do with it. We are tasking with the judge to look at this massive information about all the people who did or did not commit and try to form some judgments. So it's natural to ask the question, could we build an algorithm based on the data and do something about this? Or at a minimum, find information the judge did not. And it turns out you can. And the magnitudes here are striking. So if you build an algorithm with a large city's data set, you actually find you can sort who is high risk and low risk so much more efficiently. I'll use the second example, that you can get the crime rate that you have today and reduce jail populations by 40%. You can close Rikers in July with no effect on failure to appear or crime. That is a crazy fact. In addition, if you build the algorithm correctly, you reduce racial disparities. I'm not proposing here we automate the judge. I'm simply pointing out that the ability to find signal that we could not, the ability to process data, shows how experts who make some of the most important decisions that we are involved in can actually be helped by these tools. But the story gets a little more extreme. Here I ask, can algorithms help? We might ask, why can they help the judge? What is the judge getting wrong? To answer that question, instead of trying to understand which defendants are at high risk, we could turn the camera away from the defendant towards the judge and ask, who is the judge releasing that they shouldn't, and who is the judge jailing that they shouldn't? You can build a predictive model of the judge and ask ourselves, what does that model find? Well, let me walk you through. So which factors predict a judge's decision? Well, the fifth most important factor that predicts a judge's decision above and beyond risk is whether the current charge is a drug crime. Judges seem to overweight this. The fourth most is whether the third, we're starting to see a pattern develop here. And I'm sure you're all trying to guess which current charge is number one on this list. These findings have led the legal scholar Cass Sunstein to have a paper that is evocatively called Current Charge Bias. Amongst the ocean of data, the judge pays too much attention to current charge. Well, it turns out number one on this list is the current charge of having the wrong face. Now, a couple of things I should say. First fact, it's not like we told the algorithm what to look for in the face. It just popped out that the pixels of the image matter much more than everything else. Second, there's a lie in this slide, an implicit lie. The implicit lie is that somehow we have 5 things. Number one is this. That's not true at all. If I delete every single thing I knew about the defendant, everything, their past history, their record, their family, everything, the arrest record, and just kept their image, and just predicted who will be released based on their mugshot, that's about half of the predictable variation in who is released. Judges don't know they're doing this. Judges don't want to be doing this. So, what's causing it? You can do a little bit of work. I'll give you 2 factors within the image that's doing some work that should give you a sense of how big these are. These are all synthetic mugshots. The first, you can see from left to right, one of the same person morphed is much more likely to be released. Maybe you can see it in that image. And it's well-groomed. People who are well-groomed are much more likely to be released. I'll explain how much in a second. Another factor that pops out of the algorithm is seen here, which is like full-faced, heavy-faced. I think I wanted to call it fat-faced, but you can't really put that in an academic paper. Not only are these 2, amongst other things, very important, I'll point out something. I don't think, well-groomed after the fact, you could say, oh yeah, I can imagine it. I don't even know what direction it goes for full-faced. Are you more likely to release a full-faced person or more likely to jail a full-faced person? Not only are these things important, the magnitudes are large. Moving from bottom quartile to top quartile of either of these is about half the effect of having committed a very serious violent crime or murder. And the answer is that you should get yourself cleaned up and eat something. So, algorithms can help us decide, and the magnitudes involved, and I picked something particularly serious because this is amongst the most consequential decisions an expert can make, and even there, a large amount of value is being left on the table, value that has a lot of meaning to a lot of people. Speaking of consequential decisions, the third lesson takes us to healthcare. So there is something in the health system that is called care coordination programs. Care coordination programs are built on a very basic principles, which is there's a few, I should just use the analogy. People in healthcare hate what I'm about to say, but it's just a much easier way of saying it. Care coordination programs are frequent flyer programs. Just like your airline says, wow, you show up all the time. Since you show up all the time, I'm going to give you a dedicated call line, a dedicated check-in test. I'm going to go to the head of the queue. They do that for people who are expected to come to the hospital a lot. So for people who are going to be particularly sick, we have found in randomized control trials, care coordination programs are extremely beneficial. But there's a question of who should be given these programs. Well, that's easy. It's the people who are going to be sick a lot. Oh, great. Why don't we build an algorithm to predict that? It turns out, starting in about 2015, these algorithms spread, and hundreds of millions of patients are being run through these all the time. And so we thought, let's just study how they work. So on the x-axis, I've taken one of these algorithms, I put the algorithm's predicted risk score. This is the only really ugly figure. I'm sorry, but this just, that's the way my job works. On the y-axis, we've put how sick the person actually is. So the algorithm's prediction of what the person's risk, y-axis, how sick they'll be. Now you'll notice one good thing is these curves slope up. When the algorithm says higher risk, the person is sicker. But you'll also notice there are 2 curves. One of these is white patients, one of these is black patients. At the same level of predicted risk score, black patients end up being significantly sicker. Now, I could say they have 28% more chronic illnesses, but that doesn't quite capture it. To help you understand how consequential this error of the algorithm is, suppose I was trying to equalize this disparity. How would I do it? I would say, let's zoom in. 98% risk score is the auto-enrollment threshold for getting into a care coordination program. If you zoom into that, what it tells you is the people right above this threshold who are black, right below this threshold who are black, are far sicker than the people above this threshold who are white. Suppose I was just to swap them out, add here and remove down there until I equalize. What would happen? What would happen is I would more than double the fraction auto-enrolled in health. Now, this has been a program that had spread. Hundreds of millions of patients have been affected, and an insanely large racial disparity had been baked into this algorithm. How did this happen? Where did the algorithm go wrong? To do that, I'm going to show you another figure. This is that same risk score on the x-axis. And it's a kind of useful thing. If you want to understand how algorithms have gone wrong, you should see where they're going right. On the y-axis is, instead of putting health, I put total dollar costs of the patient. And now you'll notice there is no black-white gap. The algorithm is perfectly well calibrated for utilization. In fact, because black patients have less access to care, and the algorithm is predicting effectively utilization, its perfect prediction of utilization is a biased prediction of actual health. So where is the algorithm going wrong? I want to put forward the proposition nowhere. The algorithm has not made a mistake. The people building the algorithm made the mistake. Algorithms solve the problem they are given. Somebody in the heart of building this algorithm decided that the way we're going to proxy for health is through utilization. The algorithm says, great, you want me to predict utilization? I can predict utilization. The mistake happens in the problems we choose to give algorithms. And that is worth remembering, that algorithmic errors are almost always specification errors. We cannot simply wash our hands and say, oh, the algorithm's doing this. No, we specified the problem. So if algorithms can help us decide, it is worth noting it is up to us to decide, and the algorithm will simply help us in components of that decision. It is up to us to decide which components and how to form the problem. These three lessons are what I want to feed into, going back to my somewhat contradictory statement that I think algorithms can expand human capacity and they can diminish human capacity. To do that, I'm going to go back in time. I'm going to go back to March 1973. A month before I was born, there was an article in the Scientific American. There's an article about how animals got around, and specifically how efficiently they were at moving around. Animal locomotion. It calculated for a bunch of animals how many kilocalories per kilometer per kilogram did each animal take. By the way, these are units of measurements since we're in the US. I should have done this in some other, they're kind of like miles. This was a figure from the Scientific American, from the actual thing. They kind of put body weight on the x-axis, cost of transportation. And now they said which animals are efficient. The things at the top are inefficient. For example, mice, very inefficient at moving around. Man, as people were known back then. Somewhat in the middle. Salmon, quite efficient. Why am I telling you all this? I don't know, I just had time to burn. No, because this figure, weirdly enough, this figure seemingly about biology is actually one of the more, in the folklore of computing, is one of the better known figures about computing. Why? Because there's a point on this thing that's an outlier that some of you may have noticed. The most efficient thing on this figure is at the bottom, is man on a bicycle. Steve Jobs, seeing this figure, said, oh my goodness, this is what computers should be. Bicycles for the mind. It's a very interesting, almost dated reference. It feels evocative, but it doesn't feel like it meets our moment. The reason it doesn't feel like it meets our moment is we actually have two different views of computing. Bicycles for the mind and replacements for the mind. And these two very different views of computing get back to, will AI diminish human capacity or will AI expand human capacity? Much of the reasons we feel they'll diminish human capacity is because we are trying to replace the mind. Much of the reason we should be optimistic is if we decide to build bicycles for the mind. If you go to the judge example, if you decide the way I'm going to help the judge is I'm going to build an algorithm that decides like the judge would, that's automation. You could alternatively say, I'm going to help the judge decide by finding the thing they care about and trying to help predict that better and let the judge decide. Notice if I were to automate, I would bake in the mugshot problem. I would bake in all of their mistakes. So this distinction, algorithms automating versus algorithms aiding, is the core fork in the road we face before us. It's an important fork because if we decide to automate, human performance is the ceiling. But there's no obvious ceiling if we decide that we're going to combine. If we decide to automate, there's no division of labor. If we decide to aid, there's comparative advantage. If we decide to automate, you know what we get? We save some dollars. But if we decide to aid, we have fundamental advances in quality and efficiency. And so to me, choosing between these two very different views of computing is the core thing that we have to do. And coming back to the point of this conference, opportunity times AI, let me just kind of bring this point back and concretize it for, will AI expand opportunity or will AI diminish economic opportunity? I think when you see this, I think most of us intuitively like, oh, it's going to diminish economic opportunity. And that's right. Because if these things are automating away jobs, you know where that is headed. But they could just as easily expand economic opportunity. To do that, part of what I want to tell you is when we think of economic opportunity, we think of these amazing figures that have been produced in the last 20 years. But those figures hide what is happening to people and what a person's experience looks like in this world. So let me tell you the story, a positive story of Pamela. She just got a promotion. So she's like, oh, I got this promotion. You know, I'm going to get a new apartment. So she chooses an apartment, pays a deposit, signs a lease. She goes out, buys some furniture, gets her kids enrolled in school. It's a path up. She's moving up. Behind the scenes of what Pamela is doing, though, something less than good is happening. When she chooses this apartment, here's what she did. She found a few good apartments. She picked one of them. What Pamela didn't know was that in one of them, she would qualified for low-income housing assistance. She had no awareness of that. So she picked a effectively far more expensive apartment. That's a big opportunity cost gone in Pamela's life. But it kind of gets worse. The landlord says, oh, you've got some poor credit. I'll need an extra month of deposit. Well, Pamela didn't have that, so she went and got a payday loan. Now, as you may know, payday loans are very expensive. For that 1 month of rent over the next 3 months, she might end up paying that back doubled or triple. Then when she went to buy the furniture, well, she'd already put what she had, extra money into that extra month of deposit. And she's like, oh my God, where am I going to get furniture? Good news for Pamela. There's a store nearby that offers rent to own. Bad news for Pamela. It's rent to own. For a $500 TV, she might end up paying $2,000. When she went to enroll her kids for school, you know what happens? She shows up. They're like, oh, you have to choose a school. She goes, there's some big website. She's like, I have no idea what is happening here. I don't know what a good school is. I don't know how I'm supposed to assess these charter schools. What am I supposed to do? Well, she went with the default option. Again, that is not a good choice. Pamela's experience is the experience of poverty. The experience of poverty is sort of an accumulation of errors created by circumstances in which it is very easy to get things wrong. These errors compound for herself through finances. They compound perversely through society of market equilibrium. If people are picking rent-to-own stores, the market for financial services is utterly out of whack, as we all have experienced, especially for low-income individuals. It's not a tax. It is the barrier to economic mobility. So when you look at these figures, I think we should look on the left and ask what the lived experience of Pamela looks like. And the lived experience of Pamela is that the problem of poverty is, of course, a lack of money. But it is also The challenge of getting out of poverty requires Pamela to walk a tightrope. Making mistakes is very hard to avoid. Money goes to paying off past mistakes. And the mistakes of experts, we go back to judges, we go to every expert surrounding Pamela, becomes Pamela's mistake. A different way of saying it is there is a meaningful shot on goal of how bicycles, the theme of this conference, AI, can truly change economic opportunity. So whether we expand economic opportunity or diminish opportunity, once this, again, brings us back to this trade-off we must make between what kind of AI future we will have. How do we pick between these futures? Well, I have some bad news, good news. Bad news, all the market incentives are for the bottom. Cost savings are the highest return thing. Good news, those of us in the room can support the activity to put opportunity expanding AI. We can make a difference. Bad news, the tech stack, so to speak, going pretty far down, is built around automation. Good news, the tech stack was built by R&D. We can invest in changing the bottom of the tech stack towards the top. So to me, the good news, bad news is at the level of we are at a unique moment in time where we can choose a fork in the road. Like many technologies, lock-in is paramount. If we don't act now and move us towards the bicycle's path, I think we have a chance of getting completely stuck. That's the choice I've made. That's why I moved to MIT, because I do feel academic institutions, computer science departments have a big role to play. I say computer science departments because I spent a big part of my career in economics. Now I spend it in both. One thing I find appealing about computer science is it's a little, not to disparage my economics colleagues, it's a little different from other academic disciplines. It is one of those disciplines that is truly and deeply motivated by hard, real, ambitious problems that they want to solve in the world. That's how we ended up here. ImageNet, cryptography, LLMs, those all came from the deep R&D of the world. So the optimistic message I will leave you with is CS thrives on taking on big, ambitious goals. You know what a big, ambitious goal is that they would love, that we should all love? Building bicycles that improve economic opportunity. All right, thank you.